Hey everybody, Martin from Quad Spinner here, and today we're going to be covering dusting. Dusting is one of my favorite nodes for snow in Gaea. It can give you extremely nice micro detail that truly enhances the texture of the mountain, and you get a bunch of control so you can dial it in perfectly to your needs. So without further ado, let's jump straight into the node, and afterwards I'll kind of run down how I made this kind of cool, mineral rich looking rocky hill slash mountain with a bunch of snow on top. So when we get into this node, this is kind of what you'll see. We'll get into the settings right away. The snowfall settings are quite simple. The strength, of course, is the strength of the snowfall. So if we lower it, you'll get a lot less snow. And if you turn it up, you'll get more snow. The snow line controls the height of the snow. So if you want the snow to be purely placed on your upper peak areas, you'll just turn it up. And lowering it will make sure the snow becomes visible at lower areas too. The fall off works a little bit differently than your regular gradient fall off. It actually kind of controls the strength instead of just having a gradient fall off where it just kind of fades out. You'll notice that the upper areas are a lot more full and dense than the lower areas where it's a lot more kind of scattered and see-through. Normally I work with a fall off of around 0.5, which is the default setting. Now, if we want to have our mountain with a lot of snow on top, but we also want to keep a little bit of like scattered sprinkled snow in the valley, we can just turn up the fall off and you'll get that snow down there very lightly. The cool thing about this fall off is that it really looks natural because it will have some really dense bits even at lower areas, just less of them, while the top area of course is just completely covered in a denser layer. Now for the distribution, we'll see that the base setting is set directional. This means that the snow will only be on one side of the mountain. You could use this to mimic sunlight hitting a mountain from a certain angle. You can think that the dusted snow is quite thin, so when the sun comes up and hits one side of the mountain, it melts on that side. However, it stays on the shadowy areas. If you look at a lot of reference imagery, you'll see that this is quite common. We can control the direction of the snow by just playing with the direction slider. If we lower the coverage, the angle at which the snow is appearing becomes smaller and smaller. And if we increase it, you'll see that the snow kind of starts creeping over, and you'll see that the snow becomes more visible at more angles of the mountain. If we turn it all the way up, you can almost get like a full coverage. You'll only see that the density is slightly different. So you'll see on this side is completely dense, and on this small side it's a little bit less dense. If you just want your mountain to be fully covered in snow, you can also just turn off the directional setting and you'll have an even spread all across your terrain. The coverage slider does not impact the snow distribution anymore once the directional setting is turned off. At this point, you just use your strength and melt settings to kind of dial in that density. The peak setting will actually distribute more snow along the peaks. So if you want your peak of the mountain to be completely covered, then you can just turn this up and you'll see that you'll get extremely white, densely packed snow on the peaks of your terrain. Slope coverage kind of speaks for itself. It masks the snow from the slope. So if we lower this, you'll see that the slopes become a lot less affected by the dusting. And if we turn it up, you'll see a lot more of the dusting all over the terrain. Now, if we turn off flow, you'll actually see it more accurately. I would say that slope coverage is a great way to kind of mask out your cliff areas, but if you want to be more precise, you can always just use a multiply with the actual slope selection, like so, on top of your dusting, just to make sure that you really don't get any dusting on cliff areas. Flow will kind of create a flow texture on top of the dusting. It also kind of blurs out the dusting, so you'll see that it's less intense. So if we turn it all the way off, you see it's quite sharp. And if we turn it up a bit, it blurs the actual distribution a little bit, but you'll also get these little flow lines running down your mountain. I personally turn it off and use color erosion just to have a little bit more control. But if you just only want to use dusting, you can easily use the flow setting inside of the node. Melt works a little bit differently from strength, whereas strength actually controls kind of the overall density. Melt really dials in kind of the faded areas. So dusting is not just a 1 and 0 value. There's a bit of a fade in between. You'll see this a lot in real life imagery where the snow is not dense enough to completely turn the terrain white. You'll kind of get this grayish looking effect of the dusting laying on top of the terrain. And we can get that by turning down the melt. You'll see a bit of this grayish, like half dense area appearing. Now, the base value is set to 0.4 where it's less visible, but basically lowering the melt can just kind of make your dusting look a bit more soft rather than a very sharp fall off. If we turn up the melt, as you can see here, it becomes very contrasty. Gritty is just a very light contrasty effect. If we turn it off, it's a very slight difference, but you'll see that the brighter areas are becoming a little bit less bright. It's a very light effect and it's better seen at higher resolution. If we use include existing snow, it will take the snow from the previous snow nodes and add it on top. This way you don't have to use a combine node to combine the two together if you'd like to keep your node stack quite compact. We also have seed controls, and then we have artistic control, which actually masks out flat areas of your terrain. It's just an interesting control in case you need it. However, most of the time you'll probably keep this at 0. The texture input is quite useful for people who don't want to create a very large texturing node stack. You can actually just plug in your color texture right into this texture input and you get it all together at once. However, doing it this way, you do lose the include existing snow option, so be aware of that. All right, so now I'm going to actually showcase to you guys how I created this kind of sandstone, mineral rich looking hill with a bunch of detail, and the snow is really making sure that those details pop. Let's start from the beginning. I use a Voronoi just to get an interesting base shape, and then use an edge node set to round style to create this singular terrain. Afterwards, I use rivers to make the terrain a bit more natural looking and create these natural valleys, which first were just, the classic Voronoi, where you have this very sharp concave. Rivers will make sure that turns into a bit more of a natural looking valley. At this point, I use a thermal shaper with a 0.66 shape, so it's actually going to bulk up our terrain. And I set the scale to 60. This scale is going to bulk up some of the individual elements, but also bulk up the whole terrain together. I use a warp set to the max blend mode to just create some rock detail. As you can see, it's starting to pop some rock details out here. You'll get some cool cliff details on top of your terrain without really changing the base shape too much because it's set to the max blend mode. Now I'm going to hop into erosion 2. Erosion scale set to 500, duration 25, so quite a bit. I also make sure that there's a decent amount of bed load and coarse sediments being added, so we get this rocky detail, but then afterwards also a kind of a smooth, very sedimented slope, turning this into a rocky hill rather than like a mountain with deep valleys. At this point, I take the slope and add a sandstone on top. This is just going to bring back some of the detail that we may be losing from the erosion and make this, rocky cliff detail really pop out. And lastly, I use a snow line set to 0.16 and melt 0.24. This way we're going to get these small little pockets of deep snow added on top. After this, I use a choke point and we start the texturing process. For the ground texture, I use a texture base set to equalize and a texturizer, and I combine them together. I get a sap map like this and use a medium roughness. There's not much detail in this sap map because I'm going to use color erosion to really make this look like a very sediment heavy, mineral rich terrain. Here I'm using color erosion just to get those flows in there. And at this point, we're going to add the snow. So I'm using dusting here, no direction used. Quite a high snow line, but a lot of fall off. So you'll see that the top of the mountain is very dense, but the snow runs all the way down to the bottom areas here. And there's still some sprinkled down here. I'm using a 0.25 on the peak, so I'm making sure that the peaks are really covered in quite a thick layer of snow. I'm using the 0.5, like the base slope coverage. This will make sure that the cliff areas are not covered with snow. I turned the melt down to 0.2. This way I kind of get the faded snow at the lower areas that's still very visible. And I also opted to keep the flow set to 0 because this way I really maintain that sandstone detail that you can see through the slope here. If I turn the flow up a bit, you'll start losing that detail because it starts flowing over these small ridges. However, because the flow is off, this snow mask is going to be very contrasty and you might actually spot the pixels a little bit too easy if you actually render this out. So I'm going to use a color erosion here with a diffusion set to 1 and a transfer distance of 0.01. What this will do is slightly blur out the snow. You can see it right here. The diffusion kind of warps and blurs the actual snow mask, and this way it looks a bit more natural and soft. I also use a min blend mode. This will make sure that the cliffs or the really dark areas are maintained and you don't get the snow blurring over areas you don't want it. At this point, I use a combine node, set the screen with the actual snow output from here. I use a portal to get the snow and I combine it together. And then lastly, I use another combine node to combine the snow and the actual color map using screen. It's very important you use screen because if you use add, you will actually get this effect where it brightens up the color map at these lower values. So this kind of gray value will be added on top of this color map, which will kind of create this weird saturation issue slash brightness issue. If you use screen, you avoid this and you maintain your original color map without being affected too much by the snow. Lastly, I'm just using a light X node to showcase this terrain in all its glory. So there's dusting for you. And I think we can all agree that dusting really adds so much detail and three-dimensionality to this terrain. And it especially really pops those details you get from the sandstone by kind of like showing them. You can really see those ridges in this terrain now. So yeah, dusting is an amazing node to add snow into your terrain, and it's pretty much a must for every snowy terrain out there. I hope this was a very useful video for you guys, and I hope you guys will use dusting a lot. It's an amazing node and it gives you such great micro detail. Anyway guys, hope this helped a lot. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you guys in the next one.